Hello, and happy Catholic Sisters Week. I am Kathy Williams, Communications Director for the Ursuline Sisters of Louisville. We value our partnership with Sacred Heart Schools and our shared spaces in the Mother House, including this beautiful heritage room that we're in. I personally have enjoyed working with the Sacred Heart Schools Office of Catholic Identity and Ursuline Charism to plan several events we partnered on this week, in which some of our sisters visited with students to share about their ministries. This year's theme of Catholic Sisters Week is celebrating traditions, changing the world, and we honor our Ursulines for their traditions and commitment to the future, including living out Laudato Si in global solidarity, as we will hear about from Sister Carol Curtis.
Thank you for joining us for Catholic Sisters Week. As this year's theme proposes, we are celebrating tradition and changing the world. As Ursulines, this resonates with St. Angela Merisi's counsel to keep to the ancient way, confirmed by so many saints, inspired by the Holy Spirit, and live a new life. So to paraphrase the theme, living tradition in a changing world. For my part, this is a providential opportunity to share with you insights from my experience this past December as part of a delegation to El Salvador and Honduras, sponsored by the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, that's LCWR, and the Share Foundation, to explore the root causes of migration. I would like to reflect on it from the perspective of our Ursuline Charism and of the global solidarity to which Pope Francis has called us in his 2015 encyclical, Laudato Si, on care for our common home. And it is especially this, our common home, that we're speaking of. As Ursulines, we express our charism as a contemplative love of God and a resulting openness and eagerness to serve the needs of others. St. Angela speaks of seeing with the eyes of her soul. This inner vision is both a contemplative insight and an outlook which opens us, leading us into ministry. Yet the dynamic is more integral than sequential. Community is already implicit in our prayerful presence to God, the lover of us all, who so loves this world that he sends his Son. Mission, therefore, comes from the heart of God. So also we understand otherness not as over and against us or us and them. Rather, others expresses relationship. As St. Paul says, we are members, each one of the other. With humanity itself, part of the whole of creation, and this is the meaning of Catholicity, a sense of the whole. St. Angela wraps this together in her ideal of harmony, which values both unity and diversity. As Ursulines of Louisville, we understand well that biblical expression, you were once aliens. It resonates with our own history. We came from Straubing, Germany, to teach the German immigrant children of St. Martin Parish, a church targeted by the Bloody Monday anti-immigrants riots here in Louisville. St. Angela herself lived in a time of social upheaval and displacement. She herself was a refugee at one point. So hospitality is part of our tradition. But welcoming is just the threshold for building community, to fostering a sense of belonging, especially by esteeming the dignity of each person. Over the years, one of the beautiful ways our sisters have been able to cultivate the sense of belonging is by tutoring. I think we have all experienced at different times that close relationship of working with someone, whether you are the one learning or the one who is helping and encouraging someone in their discovery. Our congregation first became involved in refugee resettlement in 1980 when we hosted the Tran family from Vietnam who lived on our campus in the old St. Joseph House Hall. In more recent decades, we have worked with Catholic charities, most recently in an ecumenical effort helping the Ibrahimi family resettle from Afghanistan. One of our sisters, Sister Anne-Mary Lochner, also has worked closely with Catholic Charities in their legal assistance for migration and refugee services. Our Peru mission, in response to Pope John XXIII's 1962 request for missions in Latin America, has enriched us in many ways, through many relationships over almost 6 decades. As our sisters have returned from Peru, they've engaged in Hispanic ministry in Pennsylvania, Lexington, Shelbyville, and Louisville. Here in Louisville, 2 of our sisters presently minister as translators at a health clinic. Yet their lived experience in Peru also provides us with greater awareness of environmental and social issues which drive migration, such as mining, deforestation, oil spills and economic exploitation, violence, and political corruption. As we are all aware, the humanitarian crisis at the border is on both sides and begins before people even arrive. Some years ago, I think in the 1980s, Sister Brendan spent a year in Nicaragua with Witnesses for Peace. I think the understanding of some of the different issues helps us realize that the trauma begins before people even set out to find a new home. In fact, these crises trigger the migration itself. Several of us have had opportunities just in the past few years, sponsored by LCWR, to assist at the border. And Sister Julie has also volunteered with Sisters in Mexico. In 2019, Sister Kathy Neely participated in the SHARE delegation to Honduras, bringing home the story of indigenous people's struggle to protect their rivers, and the witness of Berta Cáceres, the environmentalist who was assassinated in 2016 for her defense of the rights of her Lenca people and their river. Human rights were also at issue in the criminalization of the Guapinol River water defenders, who were held in pretrial detention for 2.5 years, only released in February of 2022. Criminalization of protesters is a tactic of multinational corporations. It's a form of terrorism. In 2015, Sister Janet Marie Peterworth joined the Roses in December delegation to El Salvador for the 35th anniversary, the December 2nd, of the martyrdom of the 4 church women, Mary Knoll Sisters Maura Clark and Ida Ford, and 2 with the Cleveland Mission, Ursuline Sister Dorothy Kazel and lay missioner Jean Donovan. When I arrived in El Salvador and we were being driven from the San Salvador airport, a woman in our group noted that we were on the same road that the church women were driving that night when they were forced off to a side road, driven off into a field where they were raped, shot, and buried in a shallow grave. With Sister Janet's trip, I became aware that Dorothy Kazel was an Ursuline sister of Cleveland. When a sister learned I would be going on this trip, she came out with a faded memorial card for Sister Dorothy, just like we would have for any one of our sisters here. It brought home to me our connection, and that these women were killed simply for doing a ministry so characteristic of who we are, and for staying with the people. Before I began the trip, I was acquainted with many of the issues and some of its history, and I felt a heaviness. So it came as a surprise when we arrived at Santiago de Nunhuaco, and I saw the whole community gathered for their annual commemoration, celebrating the martyrs' witness to hope, as they term it. I was surprised at the joy. As the only Ursuline in the group, I was designated next of kin to Sister Dorothy Kazel and carried her image in procession. I was amazed at the intensity of that community's dedication to these martyrs. This is not actually where the sisters ministered, simply where they were killed. It's as though it were entrusted to them, and they faithfully remember these women with their own families each day of the dead. My own sense of kinship was confirmed as we shared the Eucharist, presided by a priest of Cleveland who had served with Sister Dorothy and Jean. Our relation with the broader Earth community was brought home to me when, at the site of their martyrdom, I saw the national monument, the Tree of Witness, which was present when they were killed and the tree itself received their lifeblood. It reminded me of the cry of the earth which received Abel's blood. The cry of the earth is not only for what we do directly to the earth, but it's a cry, an outcry that both admonishes and advocates for us. As an Ursuline, when I saw on different signs this, we're more present than ever before, it automatically brought to mind St. Angela's, I'm always in your midst, more able to help you by my prayers. The martyrs are presente, as they say, still part of the community, still very much part of the life, and they're celebrated as victors and looked to for hope, witnesses of hope. Again, the sense of fiesta always catches me by surprise. Um, the saying here, because the struggle is just, hope does not falter. Just as we heard in our Sunday reading today from Romans, hope does not disappoint. Um, their triumph is looked at as a fiesta, and yet even in this little cartoon drawing, each one is distinct. We can see Archbishop Oscar Romero and Rutilio priest, the Jesuit priest Rutilio Grande, bringing their gifts right up to the altar. Um, the Jesuit martyrs of the University of Central America, you can see them bearing their roses together with their housekeeper and the housekeeper's daughter. And then over to the right, in the upper part, we have our 4 church women, each one still recognizable. And a fiesta is not complete without somebody flipping tortillas down in the corner. This remembering by name, which is so important in the Latina culture, especially on the Day of the Dead, becomes especially important in the dehumanization of war. It made an impression on me when we visited the Monument to Memory and Truth in a park in San Salvador. It's 34 wall-sized panels of names of people killed or disappeared during the Salvadoran Civil War from 1980 to 1992. There are more than 30,000 names, but it's not a complete list. The UN estimates about 75,000 lost their lives during that time. There's a whole panel that simply lists massacres, including that which is termed the Maryknoll Religious in Santiago, Nonualco, La Paz, our churchwomen. What is especially terrifying at this time is that disappearances might again be on the rise. Under the government's current state of exception, which is a kind of state of emergency but borders on martial law, due process is suspended in many cases. Uh, it's invoked to crack down on gangs, and more than 50,000 people have been arrested, which already, given that there was not adequate way of housing them or caring for their needs, it's questionable the human rights issues that may be at risk here. Um, but especially when the arrests are being made with a broad dragnet, it's an expedient time for anyone who happens to dissent, anyone you might have some kind of a grudge against. They can easily be swept up in the struggle, especially if you have some connection with the security forces or police. Um, you may have seen pictures of the mega prison that's being built, that is actually just now opened in El Salvador. Um, but disappearances also occur with ordinary citizens. At a human rights conference we attended, a man told how his wife and daughter had a small sewing business, probably on the side of the street. And evidently they didn't make the right connections with the gang members or paying tribute to whoever um, had control of the area. And so they both disappeared. At the time we met with this man, it seemed that the wife had been able to return, but the daughter was still missing. Just before we headed to Honduras, a state of exception was declared there as well, perhaps for fear of a spillover of violence from El Salvador. One person in our group did not have a US passport. He had a green card and the updated COVID documents, but evidently those were a little different from what they were expecting at the border, and so he was not going to be allowed to cross over. Except for our solidarity and advocacy, he may have been detained. And that's a frightful thought, because even if someone is detained for some legitimate reason, if in some of the shifting it's decided that they need to move them to another location, they could easily be caught up in that dragnet again that just moves people from prison to prison, where even family members don't know in what prison or where their family members are being held. We traveled to the Bajo Aguan region, which is where the land and water defenders are struggling for their community's legal rights to protect the Guapinol and San Pedro rivers from mining. They're also struggling to uphold the agricultural reform, which allots them plots for family farming, and that's being encroached upon by palm oil companies. If we could move that. Yeah. In Tocoa, which is in that region, we visited the San Pedro River waterfall. As I went up close to the waterfall with a woman from the village, it's kind of in awe at its magnificence and beauty. A village woman with me said reverently, it's a gift of God. So when they're struggling to preserve this is their life. It's true, but it's also something they feel responsible for. And the people actually began their protest when the mining company first began clearing ground for its open pit operations, and the Guapinol River turned brown. Again, the way the corporations are able to get in is by what's referred to as concessions. So even though this is a national preserve that does not allow for development, all it takes is for a corrupt official to sell a concession that says, we'll make an exception for you. It's not legal. It doesn't follow the due process. It doesn't allow the communities to be represented, and it's against the law. But one foot in the door. That's where death squads are kind of enlisted to kind of enforce their presence there and to terrorize the people. But it was at this moment when they realized, what was the beginning of already the Guapinol River turning brown. That's when they began their protest. At that time, there were about 33 people who were arrested. I think there was one woman among the group. But eventually all were released except for the Guapinol 8, as Kathy brought the story back, Sister Kathy brought the story back. And they were held for 2.5 years with kind of corrupt local judges, but never even brought them to trial. So it was kind of a terroristic tactic. It was really only when a new government came in power that they were able to oust that they were able to bring it to the Supreme Court, and the case was thrown out, and they returned home. But during that time, there were women who took up the leadership on behalf of the community. The mayor, I believe, actually is a woman. We could move, Kathy. So we climbed down from the waterfall to begin our conference, sitting on the rocks in the middle of the river. I felt like I kind of stumbled into the pages of the gospel, the sermon in the river. As representatives from the villages spoke of why they were in the struggle to protect the water, how it was their life, it was like they were speaking the Beatitudes. Several simply began, I was one of those who was arrested. I was a little bemused by this meeting in the river, not about it. And it was then that it occurred to me that the water itself had voice. We could hear the waterfall. We could hear it rushing, the water rushing past us. And I realized the importance of being in right relationship with all of creation. Not exploiting, and not commodifying it, but right relationship. And that's Angela. Again, I think we're back in the gospel again. uh, yes. Look familiar, Kathy? We returned to the village for lunch. You know, hospitality is just part of the way they live. Solidarity and community are how these people survive. It's their way. It's their outlook on the world. Um, the Guapinol 8 were back home, and there was something about just in those little gatherings to see the mother whose son had been returned from prison after 2.5 years. You can't see it was some kind of soup. It had some vegetables. I'm pretty sure it had some chicken in it. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but I'm sure it was provided um, out of uh, out of their poverty, and but out of from the heart. In fact, we were actually meeting in the home of a widow. Who has kind of sponsored us, maybe because she had the longest table. I don't know if that's the Mershon's table. But again, you have the sense of, even with this heaviness of these issues, the joy of the people. They do not want to leave their home. They're fighting for the right to stay where they are, the right to live. Uh, the Again, one of the issues that you're dealing with the question of the mind, and we're familiar with this, I think, thanks especially to Sister Jana Marie, because tragically, because of the issues in Appalachia, that the mining, just you're just getting toxins into the waterway. You're basically poisoning your waterway. And when you're talking about doing that up at your headwaters, that means that's the whole country's water on pouring out finally to the Caribbean. So it's not just that they're fighting for themselves; they're defending the waterways of their whole country, and it's kind of a good inspiration for us here in Kentucky, this land of many waters. Uh, Tragically, just since my return, two of those water defenders have been assassinated. Vamos a milpa. A la milpa is actually literally to the returning to the cornfield, but this kind of return to the land. I mentioned the agricultural reform that was supposed to provide people with kind of enough land to provide for their own family, just basic needs. UN refers to that as food sovereignty. Um, uh, uh, Part of our group visited, the ones who were actually involved with the land defense, and one of those land defenders also has been assassinated since our return. The environmentalists, when we talk about environmentalists, we're not talking about Ivy League professors. We're talking about people who live there, who are part of those communities, who are advocating, and they're informed. This is not just, they really they have as much technical awareness as anyone, but they really are part of these people. And at the beginning of Laudato Si, with ecological spirituality, one of the first prayers, it was a surprise to me, that was encouraged was a prayer for environmentalists because they are targeted. It's a specific group that is targeted for assassinations. It's a global characteristic. Any place where you have particular defense, whether it's the Amazon, whether that it's just a characteristic approach, terroristic approach that multinational corporations in particular, but we always have to be careful as well about our own corporations that have connections there, because that's a place where our government could put pressure on them. And I think, but it's also an important awareness that when we think about supporting um, private enterprise in these countries as a way of bringing development and improving the lives of people, we need not to be naive about why people go to to establish their businesses. There certainly are people that do good work there in countries, different countries, but we need to not be naive and think that corporations going in are there to benefit the people or the land there. Again, besides violence, corporations have political or judicial connections, which allow them to subvert or bypass legal channels. I'll also say that security forces, you can change who's in charge of a government at the top, but it doesn't undo the whole security force system and its different alliances. So it's a real challenging situation. Kathy. Finally, we visited a village that was that's on the Ulua River that was recovering from flooding from a hurricane. I think it was formerly, some years back, it had been just a little banana company village. It was been a company camp, really. So it wasn't well connected, as you can imagine. It was still deep in mud. And palm plantations along the banks do not hold the soil. So silt from erosion has raised the level of the river, and the levee is no longer high enough. The river itself needs to be dredged, especially since rains are heavier due to global warming, as we've learned in our own country, just from what I know just more recently from Florida and what we heard about the flooding in Appalachia. Um, I think getting close. Again, in this village, we began with kind of a presentation on the part of the villagers themselves, different ones as representatives of kind of what the challenges were, what the experience was like. Sister Jana Marie, you remember very well how people need to retell their story, and what they need to recover, what they are thinking. The first woman who spoke is shown here. And she came back at the end after we had walked through the muddy village, climbed up the levee and then down toward the river. So we were pretty muddy. And as we came back to the bus, she met us. It was raining, but she met us at the bus with a jug of water and insisted on washing our feet, each one. So I'm kind of pulling back, kind of like, and of course, what comes to mind is Jesus speaking to Peter. If I do not wash you, you have no part in me. Um, and I realized the gift of being in relationship with others and the need to discern our responsibilities. Mordecai has said, to give one's life in whatever way for the defense of the rivers is to give one's life for the good of humanity and for the good of this planet. Catholic theology speaks of charism as a gift given by God for the good of others. Gratia gratis data. It comes from St. Matthew's Gospel. Freely you received, freely give. What are your gifts for the common good, for the good of our common home? We'll give St. Angela the final word. She reminds us, we are each creatures of God, and God knows well what he desires to make of each of us. So it is for each one of us to discover in creative fidelity how we are to be presente in this world for the glory of God. Thank you.
Carol, how long were you there?
A week in each country.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how many?
Just 2 weeks because we went. Yeah, first there. Okay.
No,
Okay. All right. I'm not sure. Did you want to just kind of take a pause or? Okay. I think we're kind of suggesting that we just take a couple of minutes. You can kind of let this sit a little bit and then see where you want to go with anything, whether it's comments of your own or whether it's questions. So let's just kind of give it a few minutes. Yeah, just a few minutes. All right. wanted to first speak my own little mea culpa there. This does work if you actually plug the piece into the computer. Okay, thank you. All right. But I want to welcome you to make your own comments. You don't have to. It doesn't just have to be question answer. Your own comments, your own insights. We've talked about this is Catholic Sisters Week. So we all have different experiences, different connections along the way. So it's open mic.
When you were talking about the four women martyrs, you had a picture up there of Dorothy Clazel in a habit, and then there were four, and then there was a fifth one. Who was the
Yes,
fifth
I'm
woman?
sorry. I meant to mention that. The Maryknoll sisters of the two of the four churchmen who were churchwomen who were killed, um, all worked in an area called Chalatenango. So it's up farther north. And one of their sisters had actually drowned this spring before they were killed. And she drowned up at Chalatenango, so their memories kept there as well. And they're all buried up in that area where it's the custom of Maryknoll to bury in country. So they were all buried up there. The three of them are buried, and of course they keep the memory. So they just keep the memory of the five. You, Sister Janet.
She was also a companion with Sister Ita, and they were both in this jeep. And Ita managed to get out and cling to a tree, and she drowned. And so that's what took Ita then to work with Mara, because I think normally they work in twos or threes.
I think
in
Mara had just
communities.
come in
Yes,
country
Mara
recently.
just come in.
Yeah.
So that she's always pictured with them and honored with them in the
Yes,
same way.
because the Day of the Dead, the memorial, the commemoration is, that's, they're just a group that way. The other, when what she was doing at that time, when they were in the jeep, had picked up a prisoner who had been released, and they were taking him home, and that was when they were swept away in a flash flood. Thank you for bringing that up.
I just want to say how I want to commend you, Carol, on doing a wonderful presentation. I've heard many things about all of those topics because I've been here. I was here when the sisters went down in 1964 and was part of the community. And I spent some time replacing somebody who was taken out. And, I have all my stories, though. But I would just want to say to you, I think this has been, for me at least, one of the, I use the word best, but one of the put together in a way that really was most striking and most understandable and really most touching about what this picture is truly all about. And it is far bigger than any of us even begin to comprehend. And really does need all of us, each as human beings, to take it on in some way. I don't know, because I can't do a big thing, but it does take every one of us to really help make our world different and make our world a place of blessing, which it is. I mean, we know that.
I'd like to say that thank whoever came up with the idea of putting this in Catholic Sisters Week. I think it's kind of collusion. Kathy and Jane maybe. That kind of pushed me to look at it from another angle, and that has been a beauty. I mean, certainly I had the perspective from the shared delegation, Sister Janet Marie and Sister Kathy. And to some extent the Laudato Si dimension of things. But it was really helpful for me to push back into how much this is a part of who we are as a congregation specifically, but also how much this is really that we're back at Angela's time in terms of just the chaotic elements, and really the violent elements, and the forces that are really just breaking people about, and just kind of the upheaval, and to realize that this charism, this creative gift of God, came out of that context, came into that context. And so it was kind of a joy to be and I appreciate those who've put the history together in a nice, convenient format in the dome, that kind of recapitulate some of the different ways that this has been a part of what we've been doing. Even when it wasn't an upfront thing, we do it one way, different ways, and it's so much a part of about relationships. Um,
No, go ahead and finish.
no, that was it.
Oh, I want to echo what Paula said. It's very reverent and does look at the whole picture. It's beautiful. I was also, so the prayerfulness and the hope came through, but I also, part of me is like, what can we do? And I think we signed on to a letter to the State Department about the killings of the environmental defenders. Did we do that?
Kathy can speak to that more. Yeah, she brought it up at that time.
I think we did, but I don't know.
Yes, we have gotten letters online. We have a sign. When they were detained in those 2.5 years, we were constantly writing letters and doing all we could. But after they were released, everyone was so happy about it. But these are young families, fathers of families who lost their jobs during this time. But especially right after they were released, 2 were taken, 2 were killed. So it was just a difficult time and it still is. But yes, we were trying to do all we could to.
Kathy, do you want to say something about the book, the little children's book?
Oh yes, our delegation wrote a beautiful child's book.
Bilingual.
And yes, about Berta Cáceres, who was killed because she was defending that river that Carol spoke about. And at Christmas time, I wanted to put them out and see if anyone could buy them. But Suzanne, I forget her last name, and it was a Honduran artist who wrote this wonderful book. So if anybody's interested, we can get more copies. I have 1 sample copy that I'm holding on to. I had 10 that we got. Mm-hmm.
This is a different country, but it's sort of like the same church, different pew. In Nicaragua right now, things are so bad. And I'm with Friends of Escapulas, which is a sister parish at St. William's. And we have a nutrition program. And I guess you could call them environmental defenders. But 3 of the young fathers of families, young men, who are in their own way technicians and have become self-taught over how to use seeds on the Nicaraguan countryside, which tends to be very hilly and given to erosion. And they have studied and learned how to grow vegetables so that their children, who are not just constantly eating beans and rice, and therefore are not growing at the normal rate of children and are sometimes very sick. But my point is that just recently they had to quit their jobs because the government is coming after them, and we had to close down that program totally because they were afraid they were going to be killed if they kept on doing that kind of farming. And I am my signature will be on a grant that I hope the Ursuline Sisters will be able to help with through the ministry fund, because now they're trying to subvert that. And so instead of giving the seeds to the villagers, they're going to give the seeds through the clinic as medicine and hope that Daniel Ortega and his cronies don't catch on to it, so that the families will still be able to have the seeds, still be able to plant the gardens, and their children will still have vegetables. So, I mean, that's going on right now in all these places. And it has a long, long history. When Paula spoke, one of the books that she recommended that some of us read was called The Brothers, and it's about the Dulles brothers. And it was when they were in United States politics that so much happened in Central America, and they became the so-called banana republics, and we were all afraid of them because they were going to turn communist, or they said they were communist. It's such a history. It's such a history.
One thing in terms of kind of advocacy, I mean, you spoke of the letters signing on, and again, it was a gift that just after we returned, just even before we were leaving, one, there was an opportunity for a press conference. In El Salvador, it said it's not expedient to have a press conference. That kind of calls attention to people in a way that's not good. But the Catholic press actually has a very strong role, which is why it gets cracked down on, as in Nicaragua, closed down. Yes, so the Catholic Church has been playing a good role, when as it's able. But in this case, we had a press conference in Honduras, which again, that international light is one of the things that can help kind of protect the defenders. Also, just as we were leaving, we already knew that there was a delegation of, I think, from the House of Representatives that was going down to Honduras. And so we were able to make contact with the ambassador, with representatives from our group, and then we were encouraged to write letters as well. And so there was positive feedback. The role is, for the United States, because we give both military as well as humanitarian aid. Impunity is one of the biggest issues, is a big issue along the way. Because when people get away with violence, when crimes are not investigated, when even like targeted assassinations, when those are not investigated, obviously it just kind of emboldens the ones who are doing it. And even in the case of the churchwomen, that was not going to be investigated. It was only when we put pressure on the U.S. government, because the U.S. government wasn't even pressing. I mean, they were just going to sweep it under the rug as well. So it's where we put pressure, on our government to put pressure on those governments that it's kind of like, this aid that you want, we need to make sure that it's not going certain places. So we need you to look into this. The UN has a role as well, and they have been kind of vocal about certain areas, and it's particularly with indigenous communities. I'll give kind of honorable mention to the LCWR focus, which is migration and how it intersects with climate change and refugees. Migration, climate change, and and racism. I'm sorry. Yes, racism is, and sometimes you've seen the expression "forced migration." That's not just Trail of Tears. I mean, that happens too. We know it. But it's really, what are the forces, and the root causes paper kind of touches on some of that. What are the things that really press people to have to get out of where they live? So that forced migration is like, what are some of those causes? As far as racism, it's not that there aren't actual racism issues the way we're familiar to thinking of them here in the United States, the way we witness them here. But they're also with actual indigenous communities. One, they don't have the same legal clout, political clout, that other groups have. They're just kind of a marginalized community in terms of their representation and their defense. So that's where it's kind of a bigger problem. And the other thing is, because they're indigenous communities, their kind of title to land is a traditional collective title, not the one that's kind of issued. And so working out those balances legally really requires that the government have a commitment, and the UN is working to try and kind of work for some kind of way to assure that. But given that the legal system itself is, kind of gets subverted either from the inside by corruption or by politicians who sell bogus concessions that let people in, and once they've got their feet on the ground, then it's just their private death squads. So again, I will say just basically this advocacy, certainly prayer, and this awareness of the communion that we have, but this sense of community, and then the advocacy in whatever way, whether it's writing a children's book, whether it's what we do here, and I'll finish with just this little comment, but. I was in a day of service for St. Meinrad, and I was helping out over at Catholic Charities at their warehouse for Catholic Migration and Refugee Services. And at the end, we were kind of a small group working there, but at the end there was a young woman, and who I guess she was there with her mother. And said, "You're Ursuline?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I go to Sacred Heart." I said, "Yes." So, I mean, I really am grateful that we've been subverting these young women in a good, these children and young women in a good way. And so education is really an important piece of this awareness, and especially cultivating that sense of reverence for individuals, and a sense of community at the same time.
Thank you, Sister Carol. So much to walk away from this thinking about. I know for me personally, I realize how disconnected from Mother Earth that I really am. When you said the water had a voice, I thought, oh my gosh, I need to listen to that more, to get up, to get out, to be really present to that voice. So thank you so very much. We have refreshments for everyone, some salty and sweet snacks. But what we hoped kind of as we finish for today is that we are able to spend time in community, to spend time saying hello to each other, to sharing our stories with each other, and also, if you haven't had the opportunity to see it yet, to just take some time with our timeline. Sister Carol talked about how important education is, and on a daily basis, when I get to walk into this beautiful building, I just think about that so much. And so this timeline is very special to Sacred Heart Schools, and we're just so proud of it. So that's all for today, and thank you so very much for being here.